Chapter 11, Physical and Cognitive Development in Early Adulthood. Senescence. What is senescence? Senescence is the process of biological aging. And what that means is that as soon as the body is fully developed at around age 24, the opposite process begins, the process of a breakdown of bodily systems. This involves changes in the body's ability to repair itself. And those changes are negative. The body becomes increasingly less able to repair itself over time, and that is what causes the process of deterioration in senescence. There are great variations between people and within people in senescence. In other words, each person has a different rate of change, and within that same person, different body systems change at different rates. So, for example, if a person's hair goes gray very young, that doesn't mean that that person's entire body is aging rapidly, just their hair. What influences the rate of senescence? Genetics. Some people age slower than others because of their genes. Lifestyle plays a huge role, particularly diet, exercise, cigarette smoking. Environment, how much pollution, noise, etc. you're exposed to. And historical period, when and where you're born. Being born in the United States in 2014 is a terrific place and time because we have excellent sanitation, clean water, and modern science and healthcare and very good nutrition available. The average life expectancy of people has increased 25 to 30 years over the past 100 years. That means that 100 years ago, the average life expectancy at birth was 25 to 35 years lower than it is now. Now, currently in the United States, on average, at birth, the life expectancy is about 78 years. Now, that doesn't mean that 100 years ago, everybody died when they were 58, nor does it mean that currently everyone dies when they're 78. Average life expectancy at birth is a very complex calculation that people make based on life expectancy of prior generations and taking into account changes in health and longevity over time. You can calculate an approximate average life expectancy for any given year. What that means is that for people born in a given year for whom their average life expectancy at birth is 78, once they reach 78, that means half the people born in their year are still alive and half the people are not. What that also means is that every year after birth, your own individual average life expectancy increases, meaning the average is not brought down by people who died very, very young, and so you can now hope to live longer than would have been average for you at birth. A little bit complicated idea, but hopefully that made it clear. So when you see a country today that has a very, very low average life expectancy in the 40s or 50s, generally what that means is that country has a high rate of infant and child mortality. Many, many people die very young, which brings down the average. Why do we age? Why does senescence happen? Why do we eventually die? This is a question that scientists are studying. We're not going to go into it in a lot of depth for the purpose of this class, since it's a psychology class. Understand that the wear and tear theory, the simple fact that the body wears out from use, that's an oversimplification. That's just silly. We know that exercise, which is heavy use of the body, makes us healthier. So we don't get sick and die simply because we've been using our body. Instead, there are two sets of very complex theories. One set of theories argues that senescence happens at the cellular level in our DNA. Some people argue that genes are literally pre-programmed to have a limited number of times that they can repair themselves by splitting and copying themselves, which is how our body heals itself. The part of the gene that seems to control this is called a telomere, And each time the cell is required to repair itself, to split into two to make a copy of itself. That telomere, which is sort of like an end piece on the chromosome, shortens. It gets shorter at each time the gene splits. And eventually it's too short to have another split, another repair. Another theory of aging is that random events over time create damage at the DNA or cellular level. Mutations, mistakes in DNA when the cell replicates are one example. And free radicals are another example. These are molecules which are the byproducts of metabolism in the body. And free radicals cause oxidation. Oxidation is a process which damages organs, tissues. You can see an example of oxidation out in the world when you look at something made of metal that's left outdoors. Oxidation happens when it gets wet and it starts to rust. And the rust eventually breaks down the integrity of the metal and it becomes brittle and breaks. While our insides don't rust as a result of oxidation, it's a similar process. It's a way to think about it, and that's the way that free radicals damage the body. One way to counteract free radicals is to eat nutrients that contain antioxidants. These are vitamins that neutralize the effect of the free radicals. And some people believe that eating foods rich in these antioxidant vitamins will help improve our health and possibly our longevity. That's one theory. Other theories say that in addition to the DNA and cellular changes, senescence involves organ and tissue level damage. As the immune system declines, as the endocrine or hormonal systems decline, this contributes to additional damage to the body, and eventually the person dies. At this point, probably a combination of those theories explains senescence. Okay, I'm not going to ask you on the test lots of about each of the body systems and their changes. Actually, before we go on to the specific systems, there's something I want to mention. Senescence is gradual. Yes, it begins in your 20s, but you are not going to notice senescent changes until well into middle age at least, and for many, many people, not until you're much older. The only people who notice these changes right away are professional athletes, people who push their body to the limit. Everybody else has reserve capacity, extra capacity in each body system that we never bother to use. And so if we're a little bit slower or a little bit weaker, we don't notice it for many, many years. So you'll be at the peak of health in early adulthood, at the peak of performance in early adulthood, and there's nothing to worry about in senescence immediately. What you should worry about is maintaining a good diet, a good lifestyle, so that you don't damage the body, which you would begin to feel later. Okay, now going into the specific systems. Cardiovascular, heart and blood vessels, and respiratory, lungs. There are very few changes in early adulthood in the heart, but under stress and exercise, there is slightly reduced performance, meaning your stamina, your ability to keep going, very, very gradually decreases over time. Hypertension, high blood pressure, that's an illness, that's a risk factor for problems later on. Atherosclerosis is hardening of the arteries, the buildup of fat in the arteries, which then minerals from the blood stick to and form plaques, and that increases risk of heart disease later on. As lifestyle improves, disease declines, the rate of disease declines. The lungs begin to have slightly less capacity starting at around age 25, but again, you won't notice it for day-to-day activities. All the soft tissue in your body, which includes connective tissue, skin, muscles, become stiffer, become less stretchy and elastic with age. That's the senescence process. Therefore, as your lungs are less stretchy, you take in less of a full lung full of air, and so gradually over time, Your stamina for exercise will decrease a little bit, but again, only professional athletes start to notice that in their 30s. Motor performance. Similarly, athletic skills peak between 20 and 35, and then they decline only very, very gradually. If you continue training, meaning if you exercise, then that loss will be slower. You'll be building muscle, and you'll keep ahead of the loss of muscle strength, and you'll maintain stamina, response speed, and muscle mass. Okay, the immune system. Again, our immune system begins to decline in the 20s. But again, you are still at your healthiest in your 20s and 30s. You will not notice those changes right away. I'm not going to ask you about the T cells, B cells, all the different functions. Just know that in general, senescence in the immune system begins early, but is not noticeable till later on. It does mean that with each passing decade, it takes a little bit longer to recover from things, and you're a little less likely to fight things off than you were when you were younger. And stress, both physical and psychological, weaken immunity. They weaken immunity indirectly because when you're under stress, you don't sleep well, you don't take care of your body. That decreases immunity. But the other reason is that stress directly affects the immune system. Our body secretes hormones when we're under stress. These stress hormones, cortisol and adrenaline, lead to a fight or flight response. And under fight or flight, the body is putting all of its energy into things you need to be stronger and faster to get away from a physical threat. Therefore, the body takes away focus and energy and function from things that you don't need right away, like the immunity to fight off a cold. And that's why immune system weakens under stress. Reproduction. Increasingly, people delay childbearing so that they can build up a career, so that they can save up money, so that they can feel emotionally ready. It's becoming more acceptable to delay childbearing. What you have to weigh against these desires to have children a little bit later is fertility. For women, fertility is at its peak in the 20s. It gradually slows down in the 30s, but up until age 35, there shouldn't be any problem. Fertility begins to decline for women more quickly starting at age 35. And so between 35 and 44, while it is still possible to have children and even a first child, fertility might be lower. There's a reduced number and quality of eggs, and therefore some intervention might be needed. Men's fertility declines more gradually, but even for men, fertility starts to gradually decline starting at 35. There's less sperm produced, and their motility, their ability to swim well, decreases, and there's an increased risk of abnormal sperm. Again, for men, this is a more gradual problem than for women. Okay. Variations in health. The United States is much, much healthier than countries that are less industrialized, less wealthy, but we don't do as well as other industrialized countries such as Western Europe and Canada. Why? A lot of people in America are obese. We have a big fatness problem. We have a lot of guns. We have a lot of violence. And we lack universal health care. We also have a lot of poverty here. We have a big variation, a big spread between rich and poor. And obviously people who are poor have less access to health care, to nutrition, and to a good environment. As you can see, the leading causes of death in early adulthood remain accidents. Why? Because we are still pretty healthy in early adulthood. Cancer and cardiovascular disease are now on the list. They weren't in the teenage years. Now they're there. You see the process is beginning. But again, not common at this age. They become more common later. All right, overweight and obesity. What causes it? Well, you eat too much, you exercise too little, you get fat. That's the simple answer. The more complicated answer is that there are genetic predispositions to hold on to weight and to have difficulty losing weight. There are ethnic variations, cultural variations. And as we age, our metabolic rate, our metabolism slows down. And we also tend to exercise less. So people tend to gain weight as we age. We tend to be our very thinnest in our teens and to slowly gain weight over time. This, again, could be turned around by eating less, moving more. Okay, why is it bad to be obese? I think that one's obvious. Health problems, social discrimination, and mistreatment, other forms of discrimination, people not being nice to you. So how do you treat obesity? Well, again, diet and exercise. But if you have trouble with that, record keeping sometimes helps. Sometimes you're just not aware of what you're eating, so keeping track of it can help. Making simple lifestyle changes, decreasing portions, moving to a healthier diet, getting social support, doing it with a friend, improving your problem-solving skills. Okay, fat. Now, interestingly, scientists are now wondering if the low-fat craze actually led to bigger problems with obesity and diabetes because people switched to starches. However, that's not to say you should eat a lot of heavy fats. It's better to eat some fat, but it should be around 30% of your daily calories. You shouldn't cut it out altogether, and you're better off having fat from vegetable sources or fish than from meats. Okay. Dietary fat and high blood pressure among Africans in 3 regions. We went over this slide in class just to very, very briefly repeat that. What it basically shows is that hypertension and eating a high-fat diet are much more common among people of African descent born in the U.S. versus the Caribbean versus West Africa itself. What this also shows, however, is that there seems to be not a perfect link between blood pressure and fat, or blood pressure and salt, or blood pressure and diet in general. That's part of the problem. But the reason that African Americans in particular are so prone to hypertension and so prone to dangerous hypertension probably also has a stress factor involved. Being in a minority adds a layer of stress which a black person in West Africa would not experience where they're in the majority. Okay. Exercise, again, this talks about recommendations for exercise, barriers to exercise for people with low socioeconomic status, and that women are less likely to exercise than men because we push sports more with boys than we do with girls, but exercise is important. Why? This explains why. You can just read through it, straightforward. One thing though. Why does exercise have mental health benefits? Because it gets more blood up to your brain. And getting more blood up to your brain keeps your brain healthy. Okay, substance use. Use of substances, whether it be alcohol, smoking, or drugs, tends to be at its highest in the late teens, early 20s. Why? Because people are going out and there's that social aspect to it. People have fewer responsibilities. Fewer people have children to come home to, and so they're more likely to use those substances in a social context. However, most of them stop, but a small percentage become abusers. What constitutes abuse? What makes you an abuser rather than simply a user? If you are using any substance so heavily that it interferes with your functioning, you have trouble getting up the next morning, you're frequently calling in sick from work, your behavior changes and people tell you that they're having problems with you or you recognize you're having problems, then your substance use has become a problem. Cigarette smoking, just don't do it. It is the worst thing you can do for your health. The absolute worst thing. It is worse than drinking. It is worse than drugs. It is worse than obesity. It's worse than everything. And it's very addictive. Alcohol abuse in early adulthood. Again, as I mentioned, problems. Treatment is difficult. And often people relapse. It's very important to get away from triggers if you have an alcohol problem, not to hang out with the same people or go to the same places that trigger drinking. Okay, sexual attitudes and behavior. We have better data on this these days than we used to because people tend to be more honest. In the past, you had this very, very funny phenomenon where most men would say they'd had sex, And most unmarried women would say they've never had sex, which would lead you to question, who are these guys having sex with? It sounded like there was just one or two women who pretty much were dating every single guy in the universe. And clearly that was silly then, and it was a lie. Women underreported, men overreported. Now people are much more likely to be honest because it's more acceptable, and so we have better data. Most people tell us they've had sex by the time they're 25. And interestingly, this is a change from the 60s and 70s and 80s. Most people say they have sex in the context of a relationship, a monogamous relationship. It may not be their only one in life, but people tend to have one partner at a time. However, the media are full of sex, and clearly people are not doing as much as the media suggests they're doing, as this slide points out. Gay attitudes and behavior. Public acceptance is growing, which is a good thing. Discrimination is never good. It's estimated that about 3.5% of the U.S. population are either gay or bisexual. And sexual behavior is similar to heterosexuals. People are people. If you believe that, wow, there seem to be more than 3.5% of people in New York City that are gay, that's probably true. Why? Because if you're gay, you want to live in a place where people accept you. And you're much more likely to be open about it in a place where people accept you, like New York City. So in larger cities or more educated places, gays are more open, and there might be a little higher than 3.5% percentage living there, a little bit lower in more rural or old-fashioned areas, traditional areas. Okay. Risks of sexual activity, STDs, is self-explanatory. Sexual coercion, rape. 18% of U.S. women say that they've been raped at one point. And some men are raped, and obviously that's underreported because men feel more embarrassed about it. The perpetrator's personal characteristics and cultural forces predict their behavior. What does that mean? It means that if sexual coercion takes place, if a rape takes place, it's not because women were dressed skimpily or because men were overwhelmed with desire for a particular woman. Aggression is aggression. Hostility is hostility. If a person doesn't want to have sex with you, that's not a romantic encounter. If you're forcing them to do it, it's an attack. It's violence. And so it's violent tendencies on the part of the perpetrator that are the problem. Okay. People who do rape other people tend to be manipulative. They tend not to have remorse, meaning they don't feel sorry. They think violence is okay. They accept all sorts of myths that really she was telling me she was interested in me, even if she said she wasn't. They can misinterpret cues. And two things you should note from this slide. Child sexual abuse. Abusers were generally abused in the past, and they copy the behavior. And also alcohol is usually involved. It dulls everybody's senses. It disinhibits, meaning it takes away that voice telling you you shouldn't do that, and people behave badly. And of course, victims of rape often have had alcohol, and so they don't, not necessarily able to protect themselves in ways they might have been if they were not drunk. That doesn't mean it's their fault. It simply means that that's what happens sometimes. Consequences. Obviously, it's a trauma, and people experience post-traumatic stress. Prevention. We need community services. We need services for victimized men who are completely ignored. And we need to validate the experience, meaning if it happens, we need not to dismiss it. People need a chance to talk about it and get some help for it. And safety planning. People should always think through how to keep themselves out of unsafe situations. Psychological stress. Again, we talked about the risks of stress. And all sorts of things cause stress, both traumatic experiences, big life events, and also daily hassles, little day-to-day things. And people who have low socioeconomic status tend to have more stress, fewer resources, live in a worse neighborhood, crappier job, more stress. And stress is associated with health problems. Okay, now we were going to move from the physical to the cognitive. Piaget and post-formal thought. Remember when we left our young adults, we talked about formal operations, abstract thought. Abstract thought is very important, and it helps us do higher order math, logic, reasoning, science, and solve day-to-day problems. However, sometimes real-life problems don't have only one right answer. That formal, systematic, scientific process of figuring out what to do doesn't work for every situation. Many life situations have multiple points of view, multiple possibilities, and sometimes the right answer depends upon the context. And so we're going to look at two theories of post-formal thought, adult thought that is more mature, more developed than formal operations. Perry talks about epistemic cognition. Epistemology means the study of knowledge. Epistemic cognition means thinking about how we know things. And we're going to talk in a second about his theory. And then a second theory is going to be Leboeuf-Wolf's pragmatic or practical thought and cognitive affective complexity. When things get complicated between the cognitive, our thinking, and the affective, our feelings. Okay, epistemic cognition, that's Perry's thinking. Perry believes that people go through three phases of developing this more sophisticated post-formal thinking. So the first one, dualistic thinking, is actually more immature thinking. That's what people think when they're younger, when all they have are concrete operations or formal operations. Their thinking then is dualistic, yes or no, right or wrong. Is it true or is it not true? As people are more educated and have more life experiences where they're forced to think about complicated problems, their thinking becomes more relativistic. It's relative means it depends. What does it depend upon? The context. It depends upon the people involved. Each time, something may have a different answer, and there may be a different right answer for different people. That's relativistic thinking. We can't say there's only one right or wrong. We have to understand other people's perspectives and points of view. And that's a very, very good way of thinking, but sometimes that could get you into trouble too. Sometimes we can become too worried about each and every person's point of view and never make a decision. And so the most sophisticated, according to Perry, the most adult, is commitment within relativistic thinking. I see all sides, I see all points of view, I consider them, and then I commit, I make my choice. I respect the other people who disagree, but I make my choice. In order to develop this sophisticated thinking, you need the chance to tackle problems that don't have a good structure, a clear answer. Things like that Kohlberg problem with Heinz are a good example of relativistic thinking. Peer interaction, you need to meet people and you need diverse peers. Not all your peers. If all your peers agree with you and you never hear another point of view, you're never going to develop this thinking. And metacognition, an understanding of your thinking. Remember, he called it epistemic. It's thinking that understands how we form knowledge. So metacognition is important. Okay, now we're on to Leboeuf-Wolf, pragmatic or practical thought. When we say a person is pragmatic, we mean they're practical, and we also mean that sometimes they realize you can't get what you want, you can't get what's the best solution, so you pick a solution that works the best under the circumstances. So, as adulthood brings us more experience with real-world problems and the ability to think in terms of contradictions and compromises, we can be more pragmatic. We can understand this compromise. We also are able to handle times when our thoughts and feelings conflict, cognitive affective complexity. We become aware of other people's perspectives, and we're able to control our own emotions for times when we need to let cognition win out, thinking win out, but sometimes we understand that our emotions are in conflict. Okay. Expertise and creativity. These are two things that peak. Well, expertise doesn't peak in young adulthood, but we start building it up in young adulthood. Becoming an expert means knowing a lot about a particular field, having breadth and depth of knowledge in that field, and it takes time. And as we become more expert, we get better and better at understanding that field. The more you know about something, the more you can know about it, because you're able to make good mental connections to other things you already know, and you learn that topic faster. Expertise is the first step in creativity. Creativity, coming up with new ideas, finding new problems to solve within your field, thinking of things in new ways. That requires you to be an expert. You can't come up with new ideas until you understand the existing ideas. And so the 10-year rule says you need to really be doing something at least 10 years before you can be super good at it and therefore super creative at it. And early adulthood, particularly the decade of the 30s, is the peak of creativity in many fields. Why? Because it's that perfect balance of still having quick thinking, a young brain, but you've had enough time to build up some expertise. Okay, college. College is a great idea, not just because it'll get you a good job, but because it exposes you to new ideas and it improves your thinking. It develops that post-formal thought we talked about, which makes you a good thinker. It gives you expertise and helps you be creative. However, it's not just what you learn in the classroom that's important. You also want to be with the other people in college and also be with faculty outside of the classroom. So you need more participation in campus life. Now, unfortunately, at community colleges, 44% of people who start don't finish, and 32% of people who start a four-year college don't finish. And in some colleges, it's much higher. Why? Often poor preparation. People don't have the correct basic skills, and so they get to college, and it's hard to keep up, and eventually they give up if they don't get support and help. Motivation. Sometimes people are only motivated by extrinsic motivation outside themselves. Oh, I want a good job. I want to make money. They're not motivated by the desire to learn, and so it's hard for them to learn if they're not interested. Financial problems. People who are working hard don't have enough time to study. Eventually, they give up and drop out. Institutional factors, problems with the college, meaning if the college doesn't support students, students are more likely to drop out. And support has to come early so that you begin to do better and better rather than worse and worse. Okay, vocational development, career choice. When you're a little kid, we call that the fantasy period. You pick glamorous things, exciting things. I want to be a movie star. I want to be a superhero. Later, as a teenager, we call that the tentative period. Tentative. I'm thinking, but I'm not sure. You kind of bat some ideas around while you're in school. Then this is followed by a realistic period. Now I really have to think to myself, what kind of career would be good for me? What's really going to work in my life? What's realistic for me? And you need a stage of exploration. Okay, let me lay out what I want in a job. Let me lay out what I'm good at and what I'm bad at, what's available to me, and explore. And then pick something, crystallization, coming to determine what you actually want. What factors should influence vocational choice? Well, personality does, and it also should. Sometimes it influences it positively and sometimes negatively. Being an open-minded person opens you up to possibilities, and that's a good thing. You also should pick a career that fits your personality. If you're shy, you probably don't want a public speaking career, for example. If you hate math, you probably don't want to be an accountant. In addition to personality, abilities. What are you good at? What are you bad at? Again, oh my God, I'm horrible at science. Don't go with medicine. Pick things you're good at. Pick your strengths. There are also family influences. Parents often push their children into similar jobs to them, or the children kind of copy parents. That can be good and bad. Your parents can give you an example, and if you see, wow, I really like what my parents are doing, you may want to follow in their footsteps, but if you don't like it, don't do it just because they're doing it. Teachers can encourage or discourage. Gender stereotypes are a problem in choosing vocation. Slowly, conforming to gender roles is decreasing, meaning men are increasingly likely to try a women's-oriented career like nursing, a career where there's more women. Women are more likely to try a career where there's more men, and that's a good thing. Okay. Different personality types for different vocational choices. Again, that's kind of trying to match who you are with the kind of thing you will be happy doing. What if you're not going to college? How do you prepare people for a job? Unfortunately, the U.S. does that poorly. It's very hard to get training for skilled occupations that don't require college but require skills like plumbing, electrical, construction, etc. And we don't have services for vocational placement and counseling. Work study can help. In Europe, they do that, and we ought to start doing it here. Okay, that's it.